I'm Dalton Dale, a music enthusiast on a mission to learn about my favorite genre, heavy metal. Join me as I listen through and learn about the history of heavy metal music. We'll be talking about bands, albums, songs, and historical events that helped create the metal music genre as we know it today. This is the Hevolution Podcast. Hey everyone, what's going on? Welcome to this week's edition of the Hevolution Podcast. I am your host, Dalton Dale. Let's jump right in. I just want to take a moment and welcome any new listeners this week. I had a tremendous success last week with the episode featuring Matt Carter of Emory. He was wonderful, and you guys absolutely showed out and we're just racking up listens on that episode. So thank you to those of you who've listened and are joining now along for this journey. Just to give a quick update here on, I guess it's not really an update. It's really more of just a, hey, this is what I'm about. I am listening to and learning about the history of heavy metal music and sharing my thoughts. I'm exploring new music and trying to understand the influence of historical heavy metal on modern artists. Hence the interview episode like last week. I'll be trying to secure some more interviews like that and get to talk to some people who were influenced by some of this older heavy metal. And then along the way, hopefully introducing you as listeners to new music that you may not have otherwise taken the time to listen to. And so right now we are currently exploring the power metal era. And this is a focus on bands who were taking the stronger elements of new wave of British heavy metal, things like dueling guitars and soaring vocals and driving beats and rhythms, those elements that were key, successes of new wave of British heavy metal. And they were introducing more fantastical elements and themes such as the occult, fantasy-like stories, medieval elements, and those sorts of things, and also pushing the boundaries of certain elements like speed and chord progressions. And, for me, as I've gone through this process, it's been really interesting to go back to the roots of everything that I love and I enjoy. And part of what inspired this was a radio show that you can go find if you're a subscriber to SiriusXM. It's called Bloody Roots. Ian Christie, he's got a show that he goes through segments of heavy metal, and he'll play bands and artists and songs from that very, very specific subgenre of heavy metal or era of heavy metal. And listening to that, it made me realize that I don't know as much about the history of the music that I love so much. And I wanted to take the time to go and learn about it. And thankfully, he's got a book, Sound of the Beast, the complete headbanging history of heavy metal, and it's fantastic. It's a pretty short read, but it chronicles the history going back to Black Sabbath all the way forward to modern heavy metal, and just talks about the different elements and pieces of the music that ended up making up and creating this really broad spread genre of music that, is pretty popular across the world. And so, for me, I am starting to get to a point with this where I've listened to so many bands and I've listened to so many albums that I'm starting to hear those things that progress along the way. I'm starting to hear those little evolutions. Early on in this, it was a little bit difficult to kind of understand how, a more modern band like Bad Omens or Bring Me the Horizon, or, you get into some of the, like the deathcore and some of those artists, it was a little bit difficult to hear how those kinds of bands could end up being a derivative, albeit very distant, but a derivative of a band like Black Sabbath, a derivative of a band like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden, or any of those very early precursors. There were few minor elements like For example, with Sabbath, it was the downtuning of the guitar for Tony Iommi, or with Motorhead, it was Filthy Collins introducing a lot of double bass work into music and just their general speed of music. And, Metallica, obviously, James Hetfield known for a lot of his guitar picking precision and the overall, the sounds and the tones that come out of that. So there's, a few key moments that obviously you can kind of hear and derive how that would play out over time. But it was a little bit difficult to pick out some of those nuances, and I'm getting to a point now, especially going through this power metal era, where it feels like I'm able to sort of, see and hear a little bit more of how this music sort of started to evolve. And so again, just working through power metal, this includes early albums like Anthrax, Warlock, Accept, Metallica, Raven. Those are all bands that I've covered going through this section. And to me, I think this time period was really critical for heavy metal in that it branched out from what early American metal was exploring and turning into. This was a heavy emphasis and focus on record sales and music videos and the touring lifestyle, just sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And all of those things were mainstays of bands that were dominating American heavy metal. It was the rise of MTV. It was the rise of music videos in the scene. And it was, record labels and commercial media looking for something that stood out, something that was a little bit different from the normal top 40 hits that you would hear, the pop and all of those things. The Michael Jacksons and the Whams and all of those artists that were popular, Madonna, all of those that were popular and that were they're doing their thing. That's not to say or understate anything that those artists did, accomplished, or the influence that they've had on music over time. It's just that there was a point in time, and especially in the United States, where, again, commercial media and record labels were really trying to find something different. And then thus, the rise of heavy metal. Bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest were able to tour over in the States, and they were able to see a lot of success. And then you've got all of that culminating with the rise of heavy metal in America. And then there's just some bands that came along and they said, I want to do things a little bit different. They didn't want to focus as much on record sales. They didn't want to focus as much on music videos and those kinds of things. And so they shifted their focus from getting that really pinpoint sound that was curated to grow record sales and capture the mainstream, to writing more interesting music and changing up the lyrical content and sort of expanding the boundaries of what heavy metal had done so far. And for me, this is where you really start to see the split in styles and subgenres. Everything from Black Sabbath and proto metal into new wave of British heavy metal, all of it had a relatively similar sound and style to it. There was an emphasis on the guitar work, an emphasis on the vocal work, and doing things and creating sounds that were a little bit different, namely in the distortion, or with vocals, it was the high range of the vocalists that became really prominent through that time period. And then along comes power metal, and you're introducing things like faster tempos. Who can go the fastest? I mean, there's points where bands were literally just focused on trying to write the fastest, cleanest, fastest music they could possibly write. And ultimately that derives speed metal, that derives thrash metal, and all of these other precursors that come and build and are born out of what I feel like is this split here at the power metal era of heavy metal. And so that to me makes this a really critical time period, and I feel like has been very, very important to my understanding of the history of heavy metal and the history of this music scene. So that brings us to this week's band and album, and it's a band that I have been very interested in digging into because it's one that I've known about for for a while. Their vocalist is very, very well known and is one that offers very polarizing viewpoints in terms of his singing style. So we're going to talk Mercyful Fate, Don't Break the Oath. I'm going to take a real quick break, and then we are going to jump into some details about the album and kick it off. Today's episode is brought to you by the new single from my good friends in LOL. I've mentioned them before on the podcast. They are responsible for my opening song. Mr. Chris, that is doing vocals and keys for LOL, he actually composed that song and gave that to me, so thank you so much, Chris. LOL has a new song out now. It's called Let's Not Split Hairs Here. You should definitely go check it out. These guys are based out of Minnesota and North Carolina. They've got that early 2000s emo vibe, and they really are just good dudes. So be sure to go check out the song. I'm going to play a little clip for you right now, and I hope you enjoy. Make sure to find that wherever you listen to music.
And we'll pretend you never make mistakes. Each time you tell me that I'm wrong, no matter how hard I try, it's not good enough. I put myself on the line. My heart is breaking inside, but I'll survive. I'm just fine.
Thanks again to LOL. That was Let's Not Split Hairs Here. Again, go find them wherever you listen to music and follow early 2000s emo vibe, fans of Stray Light Run, Taking Back Sunday, the Get Up Kids, any of those groups. So go check it out. LOL, spelled phonetically, ELOWEL. All right, so we're back. Let's do some quick hits. So quick hit number one. This album features the harpsichord. Now, for those of you not familiar with the harpsichord, it is a piano-like instrument, and it uses keys much like a piano to activate levers that pluck the internal strings instead of like a piano that uses a sort of hammer to hit the strings that creates that sound. And so it's a little bit different, and it creates a different sound. You might be familiar with it from older like horror movies. It's a very unique sound, and I can't imitate it. I wish I could. There's moments like this when I wish I could just imitate an instrument so well that you would hear it and you would go, man, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about, but I can't. And it's usually laid out much like a piano. Sometimes it will have multiple rows of keys for different octaves, or usually have different buttons that you can push to create for different octaves, and then sort of levers and pedals to mute those strings a little bit more. Again, similar to a piano, it's just really that difference on the internal structure that creates that different sound. What is the most interesting about this is that the harpsichord was actually played by King Diamond, the lead singer of Mercyful Fate. So I found that to be really fascinating that he, as a musician, was able to play such a fascinating instrument. So quick hit number two, Mercyful Fate, along with bands like Venom and Bathory, are often created with helping birth the heavy metal subgenre black metal. Black metal specifically deals with lyrical content that is more satanic and anti-Christian. We'll have a whole section dedicated to bands that came out of that. Venom, Bathory, Hellhammer, Slayer, just to name a few. But this theme earned Mercyful Fate a place on the PMRC's Filthy 15 list with the song Into the Coven, which was from their first full-length album, Melissa. We've talked about the Filthy 15 before. Those of you that may be just joining, this was the Parents Music Resource Committee. This was Tipper Gore in the 80s, getting the government involved. This is why you see parental advisory stickers on CDs, but it was a list of the 15 dirtiest songs of the time, and it was primarily heavy metal bands that were on the list, but I think even Madonna, I think maybe Michael Jackson had a song on there as well. I'd have to go pull that list to say for certain, but I featured other bands on there like AC/DC, Judas Priest. They both had some songs on there as well. So it was a particularly difficult time period for heavy metal artists because the government was really getting heavily involved and trying to quote unquote expose parents to what their children were being exposed to through this music. And so with Merciful Fate being so occult and satanic, sort of specific in their lyrics, Into the Coven from the album Melissa, which is about a witch who was burned at the stake. That was a song that they targeted and really made sure to push as far as one of their top songs for kids not to listen to. Quick hit number 3, today's album, Don't Break the Oath. It was released on September 7th, 1984. And although the album is critically acclaimed by heavy metal fans and heavy metal musicians all over the world, it never charted after its release until it hit the top albums of the German, I'm going to mess this up, official top 100 in 2020. So you're talking, 20, what is that, 56 years basically or something, 46 years until it hit any kind of chart anywhere. And this is an album that is critically acclaimed by heavy metal people everywhere. I mean, when I was doing research on this album, almost any site that you went to had nothing but positive things to say about it. And again, listening through it, it makes sense. I mean, it's got a lot of sounds and styles that you can really hear. Ended up becoming foundational for a lot of bands, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit as far as its influence in the bands that it hit. But what I thought was also interesting is this was released in late 1984. The band broke up in 1985. So they put out an EP and two two full-length albums, and then they broke up. And now they ended up getting back together in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and then they broke up again, and then they got back together in the 2000s, and I believe they're back together and they're touring. But it just kind of shows the sorts of cycles that bands can go through, and that regardless of their commercial success, how influential and impactful a band like this can be on an entire music genre. I mean, again, they were some of the forefathers for black metal. They helped introduce, and birth speed metal and thrash metal came out of Mercyful Fate and some of the things that they did, and what King Diamond was capable of doing vocally helped kind of, shape and shift how some vocalists approach their albums as well. So that's enough for quick hits today. We're going to take another really quick break, and then we will jump into more about the album. Hey everyone, just wanted to take a quick moment and just remind you about the Hevolution podcast playlist that I've got on Spotify. I've mentioned this in a few episodes before, but I just want to give a fresh reminder for any new listeners out there. If you head over to Spotify, you can just search for my personal profile, Dalton A. Dale, and I've got a customized playlist called the Hevolution podcast playlist, and it is filled with everything that I listen to for this podcast. It goes all the way back to when I started this out as just a TikTok page and runs it all the way through to this week's episode. So be sure to go check that out. You can follow it there. Again, just find my personal profile, Dalton A. Dale, and find my playlist, the Hevolution podcast playlist, and you can follow along. We will get you right back to the episode. So let's dig into the album. I'm not going to go song by song like I have in the past for this album. There was a lot. There was almost too much for me. And so this is one that I would really, really encourage you to go listen to. I was texting a couple people about the album today, and they had offered some really great thoughts. I'll share some of those as we go. But very much would encourage you to go find that on the Spotify playlist and check it out. But let's dig into it a little bit. Mercyful Fate, they're regarded as one of the most influential heavy metal bands of the early 80s. Doesn't matter where you look up that band, where you get that information. I mean, the list of bands who cite Mercyful Fate as one of their top musical influences, it's extremely lengthy, but it includes bands like Metallica, Slayer, Testament, Death, Cannibal Corpse, Exodus, Creator. I mean, the list goes on and on. these are all bands who cited what King Diamond and Merciful Fate were doing at that time in this period of heavy metal, that cite that as direct influences. I mean, Kerry King cited the guitar work on Don't Break the Oath as one of the direct influences for Slayer's second album. I mean, Metallica practiced in a space down the hall from them while they were recording Melissa, and again, were also heavily influenced by them. So when you look at the bands that come out of this era, when you look at the bands that kind of branch out and tree off from, this time period, the impact that Merciful Fate had and that they're cited as having for all of those different bands and bands that went on to become hugely successful, hugely influential in their own right, is pretty incredible and pretty impressive. I mean, King Diamond's writing style, technique, singing capabilities, and overall performance style were all contributing factors to heavy metal subgenres like thrash metal, black metal, and even death metal. So his ability to write and perform across so many unique compositions within Merciful Fate's music allowed the band to sort of transcend power metal alone and inspire generations of new styles and sounds of heavy metal. So while they may be featured in this era for power metal, again, largely attributed to the theme of the album for Don't Break the Oath specifically that we're talking this week, but as well this overall style and approach to the album as a whole. That doesn't mean that they don't do things that deviate from that or are derivative of other sounds and styles, or I guess in this case it's not necessarily even derivative, it's really more, giving birth to other sounds and styles that became really prominent. But this album to me really does feel like an album that belongs squarely in that power metal era because of the theme and its introduction to themes that maybe had not already been being discussed. And so it's overall, it's a very prog metal sounding album with what becomes black metal themes. So as I discussed, it's very satanic and occult themed. So most of the album lyrics are really centered in and around that, and there's definitely a sort of like a creepiness to the whole album, and it's a much darker sound than what we're used to hearing maybe from some of the other power metal bands, and dark in a way that maybe was a little bit unexpected for me. But their overall sound to me is very derivative of new wave of British heavy metal, but mixed with themes of the occult and Satanism. I mean, this is really, for me, when I think back on the journey of everything that I've listened to, it really is some of the earliest form of black metal that I've heard in my listening journey. I can't recall a band that was very so specifically writing and singing anti-Christian and satanic lyrics. And so this was a pretty interesting listen for me, as I've not really, as a personal listener, I've never really gotten into black metal. It's just not really ever been my thing. And it's just not really a type of, subgenre of heavy metal that I've explored a whole lot of. So for me, this was definitely a very first time listen in overall sound and style. And a lot of the album features moments that feature very similar musical elements to bands like Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, and even Van Halen. There's a lot of the guitar work in particular reminds me a lot of what Judas Priest was doing, reminds me a lot of what Iron Maiden was doing, a lot of that dual guitar work, that harmonizing, solos and bridge structures. And then, some of the lead parts definitely reminded me of some Van Halen in a couple of the different songs. So very technical guitar solos, and just overall the sound and style, you can hear the sort of bands that King Diamond was listening to as he before he decided to go through and start Mercyful Fate. Now incidentally, he was actually in like a punk rock band before starting Mercyful Fate, and then decided they wanted to write some different music, and then that the record label that had them signed didn't like what they were doing, and so they disbanded that band, and then that's what born Mercyful Fate. They self-recorded their first EP. It was self-titled, and then they did their first full-length Melissa, also highly regarded as a very, very influential heavy metal album. And then they did this week's Don't Break the Oath. So this is again, this is a band that has been on the list for a while, and I want to just take a moment and let's talk King Diamond's vocals, because for me that was by far the most interesting aspect of this album, was what King Diamond does vocally. And I was texting a buddy of mine this week, Dakota, and I said something about listening to Mercyful Fate this week, and he had a very interesting take on King Diamond's vocals. He said that for him, he feels like you're not a true heavy metal fan until you're willing to accept King Diamond as the talented vocalist and not just some guy who's trying to do something weird. And I found that so interesting because uh man, King Diamond does some strange things on vocals. It is extremely high falsetto. He, I will say this, in his lower octave singing tone and in his mid-range tone, he's got a really incredible voice. I mean, the stuff that he does at the falsetto, I'm not saying it's not incredible. I could never, maybe when I was like 11, but like it is so high. It is I mean, he's in octaves that have not, that Rob Halford doesn't even touch what King Diamond does in terms of vocals and that upper register. And so it is not operatic, because it's not as breathy as maybe more operatic vocal is, but it is very high falsetto, and sometimes it was a little disjointed from the music. There was a couple songs in particular that I noticed that it felt very disconnected from the music, and I'm not sure if that's just the result of the recording, style and process of the time, or if that was an artistic choice to go that route for some of the songs. But for the most part, as you listen to the album more and more, it really does fit, because it creates a sort of eeriness about the album that I think goes with the overall theme and style of what Mercyful Fate were trying to accomplish. I mean, King Diamond, this is a guy who introduced the whole white face paint with black and had the upside down cross on his forehead. And I mean, that becomes a staple for like European black metal and Swedish, metal a lot. And, that to me, again, it was just all about the all encompassing feel and vibe. And, it was really just a complete picture sort of presence and sound that I think King Diamond was trying to accomplish. And for him personally, sounds like that he felt like that sort of falsetto vocal would lend really well to that overall picture. And I think it's a good choice. It definitely worked for him, and it definitely made the band see a little bit more success and see a little bit more influence than maybe what they otherwise would have seen. I mean, musically, the band itself, apart from King Diamond, is incredible. Like the songs that they're writing on it, that they're putting out, the structure is really incredible. It's very progressive, especially for the early 80s. It's not just your standard 4/4. It's not just your standard, song structures like you're used to hearing, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus and out. It's they're kind of diving into and dipping into some stuff that was a little bit different. And to me, the only other band that I can think of off the top of my head that was structurally maybe a little bit similar to Mercyful Fate goes back to like Rush. There was some songs on this album that specifically sounded to me like if Rush were to put out or not put out, but if Rush were to write a new wave of British heavy metal album, that's kind of what it would sound like to me. And so, musically as a band, it was really impressive. And again, I think King Diamond just kind of comes in over the top of that and adds a sort of air of spookiness and eeriness and creepiness to it, which, again, was all part of the bigger picture for, all of that, that style and look and vibe that he was going for. So don't break the oath. Go check it out. Make sure to give it a listen. Again, it was definitely one that I'm gonna go back to at some point just to see what I think when I get some time away from it. When I go through this process and I'm listening to this stuff to make sure that I'm ready for these podcasts, I'm listening to these albums probably upwards of 20, sometimes even 30 times just to really, really see what I hear when I'm going through those back to back listens. Cause, on a first listen through, I maybe will catch a few things that, catch my ear that grab my attention. But there's times where in the 10th, 12th listen, I hear something for the first time and I'm just thinking, oh, how did I miss that? But, it's just how your brain works when you're going through and you're listening to that kind of stuff as you are training yourself to sort of listen for and hear different things in those playthroughs. So be sure to check it out. Mercyful Fate, don't break the oath. That's what I've got for you guys this week. I appreciate all of the support. Go find me on socials, Facebook. I'm doing a Norma Jean album battle this week, and got into an interesting discussion with another of my buddies last night about what makes an album objectively better than another album. Not successful. To me, that's a different thing. And so I've also got a post out there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But, for me, it was kind of an interesting to think through and to talk about with him. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. So find me on social. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on TikTok. Search the Hevolution Podcast on Facebook. You can search Hevolution Pod on TikTok. I post little snippets and videos there that you can check out. I would appreciate the follows as well. Share this and tell anybody that likes heavy metal. I'm really hoping to just inspire some people to go listen and learn and study the history of heavy metal. I think it's important. I think it's really critical to have this information out there. And, I'm really grateful for people who've gone before me, like Ian Christie, and I'm confident there's many, many others. But I mean, this is such an important, genre of music to so many people that I think it's important to sort of document that and chronicle that history so that, people down the road, as heavy metal continues to evolve and branch off into different genres, that they'll know that. So I hope that I can inspire you all to go listen and learn for yourself. So thanks again. I hope you all have a great week. We will see you next time.